The lights cut through the thin smoke like blades, illuminating platinum hair that burned like silver fire. Debbie Harry stood before the microphone, voice of a siren, attitude of a street fighter. CBGB held its breath. The punk goddess of a generation materialized before their eyes. But behind those ice-blue eyes lay secrets that would have destroyed ordinary mortals. Street violence, addiction, and the music industry machine that devoured believers whole. "I never thought I'd live to 30, she once confessed to a journalist, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had stared death in the face more than once. In the end, she didn't just live. She endured to the point of legend. The year was 1977, and the underground clubs of New York were witnessing the birth of something that would transcend music itself. This was the woman who would transform from anonymous waitress to global icon, who would survive kidnapping attempts, heroin addiction, and the brutal machinery of fame. The stage at CBGB was more than a platform. It was an altar where transformation happened nightly. The crowd pressed forward, mesmerized by this figure who seemed to embody every contradiction of the emerging punk movement. Beautiful but dangerous, vulnerable but untouchable, accessible but mysterious. Her platinum hair caught the harsh stage lights like a halo around a fallen angel, and when she opened her mouth to sing, the sound that emerged was both heavenly and profane. But this moment of triumph was built on a foundation of survival that stretched back decades through adoption trauma, sexual assault, and the countless small violences that New York City inflicted on young women who dared to claim space in a world designed to diminish them. The goddess on stage had been forged in fires that would have reduced others to ash, and every song she sang was a testament to the power of refusing to be broken. Was Debbie Harry simply lucky to have survived, or was there something harder than steel beneath that platinum exterior? The question would haunt critics and fans alike, but the answer was written in every defiant note she sang, every dangerous glance she threw at audiences who thought they understood her. This was someone who had learned that survival wasn't just about living through trauma. It was about transforming that pain into something beautiful and terrible and absolutely necessary. The story of how Angela Trimble became Debbie Harry begins not with glamour but with absence. The absence of biological parents, of conventional identity, of the kind of certainty that most people take for granted. In 1945, adoption papers were signed on a gray morning in New Jersey, sealing the fate of a 3-month-old infant whose birth parents would remain forever unknown. Catherine and Richard Harry welcomed Angela Trimble into their modest suburban home in Hawthorne, rechristening her Deborah Ann Harry, and hoping to give her the stability that her unknown origins had denied. But stability was an illusion in the Harry household, where love came wrapped in middle-class expectations and conventional dreams that would never quite fit the wild spirit growing within their adopted daughter. From her earliest memories, Debbie felt like an alien studying human behavior, observing the rituals of suburban normalcy while knowing instinctively that she belonged somewhere else entirely. The mirror in her childhood bedroom reflected back a face that seemed to hold secrets even she didn't understand yet. High cheekbones that suggested aristocracy, eyes that promised danger, and a mouth that would one day sing anthems of rebellion to millions. School became a theater where Debbie learned to play the role of the good student while her mind wandered to darker territories. She discovered early that beauty could be both weapon and shield, that the right smile could disarm teachers and parents while hiding thoughts that would have terrified them. The suburban streets of Hawthorne felt like a prison designed to contain something that was meant to fly, and Debbie spent her teenage years plotting her escape with the methodical planning of a seasoned criminal. The mirror in their cramped bathroom became both enemy and confidant, reflecting back a truth that felt impossible to speak. Who was she really beneath the layers of suburban conditioning and parental expectation? The question haunted her daily interactions, making every conversation feel like a performance, every relationship feel like an elaborate disguise. Could these early signs of alienation have predicted the global icon she would become? The folk singers and early rock stars she saw on television seemed to be transmitting coded messages directly to her restless soul. Promises that there was a world beyond Hawthorne where being different wasn't just accepted but celebrated. The adoption had given her a name and a home, but it had also given her the profound understanding that identity was something fluid, something that could be chosen rather than simply accepted. By the mid-1960s, the call of New York City had become impossible to ignore. The city that never slept seemed like the perfect place for someone who had been sleepwalking through suburban life, waiting for her real existence to begin. Armed with little more than teenage determination and an unshakable belief that she was destined for something beyond the suburban dream, Debbie crossed the Hudson River like a refugee seeking asylum in the country of possibility. New York in the 1960s was a city in the midst of transformation, where the old rules were being rewritten by artists, musicians, and rebels who refused to accept the limitations of conventional society. For a young woman with platinum blonde ambition and ice blue determination, it was both paradise and purgatory. A place where dreams could come true or die violent deaths, sometimes within the same week. The jobs came and went like seasons, waitressing in diners where the coffee was always burnt and the customers always demanding. Secretarial work in offices where her beauty was both asset and liability. And eventually the most unlikely position of all, Playboy bunny at the Manhattan Playboy Club. The iconic costume, ears, tail, and impossibly high heels transformed Debbie into a fantasy figure for wealthy men who saw her as decoration rather than human being. But even in this most objectifying of environments, Debbie was learning valuable lessons about performance, about the power of image, and about how to maintain control even when surrendering it seemed inevitable. The bunny costume was just another mask, another role to play while she figured out who she really wanted to become. The ears and tail weren't destiny. They were temporary disguise, a way to finance her real education in the underground scenes that were reshaping American culture. When darkness fell, she would slip away from the sanitized fantasy of the Playboy Club to explore the galleries of Soho, the experimental theaters of downtown Manhattan, the clubs where new sounds were being born. These venues offered glimpses of a world where beauty and danger intertwined like lovers in the dark, where art was treated as necessary as oxygen, where being different wasn't just accepted but celebrated as essential. It was in these underground spaces that Debbie first encountered the art world that would later embrace her as both muse and creator. She posed for photographers who saw her as more than just another pretty face, attended film screenings where the movies challenged every assumption about narrative and meaning, and slowly began to understand that she was witnessing the birth of something revolutionary. The folk scene was giving way to rock. Rock was evolving into something harder and more urgent, and Debbie found herself drawn to the music that seemed to soundtrack her internal rebellion. The clubs where these new sounds were being born, CBGB, Max's Kansas City, the Mercer Arts Center, became her universities. Places where she studied the art of transformation under the tutelage of musicians who understood that music was more than entertainment. It was survival. But New York City in the 1960s was also a dangerous place for young women, especially those who insisted on claiming space in venues where they weren't always welcome. The incident that would haunt Debbie for decades happened on what seemed like an ordinary night, when an ordinary taxi ride became something out of a nightmare. A man claiming to be a cab driver offered her a ride, but something about his eyes made her instincts scream warnings that her rational mind tried to ignore. The details would vary in different tellings over the years, but the core truth remained consistent. Debbie Harry came face to face with evil and somehow managed to escape. Whether the man was Ted Bundy, as she would later speculate, or simply another predator hunting in the urban jungle, the encounter left her with a profound understanding of her own vulnerability and an even more profound determination never to be a victim again. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of the harsh education that New York City provided to young women who dared to dream beyond conventional limitations. Each survival strengthened something inside Debbie, forging a core of resilience that would prove unbreakable even when everything else in her life was falling apart. The lesson was clear and brutal. In a world designed to diminish women, survival required becoming someone who refused to be diminished. The underground music scene that emerged from the clubs of 1970s New York was raw, angry, and absolutely electric. It was here, in venues that smelled of cigarettes, spilled beer, and dreams deferred, that Debbie Harry first took the stage with a confidence that suggested she had been born to perform. The early bands, Wind in the Willows, the Stilettos, were stepping stones, experiments in sound and image that were preparing her for something bigger. When she met Chris Stein in 1973, the chemistry was immediate and complicated. He was the guitarist with the angular face and the artistic vision. She was the singer with the voice that could cut through noise and the look that could stop traffic. The attraction was both creative and romantic, a combination that would generate incredible music and inevitable complications for decades to come. Together, they began crafting something that would eventually become Blondie, though neither of them could have predicted the global phenomenon they were creating in dingy rehearsal spaces and late-night jam sessions. The sound they developed was unprecedented, punk attitude meeting pop accessibility in ways that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. It was a formula that challenged every assumption about what punk could be while remaining true to its rebellious spirit. Debbie's stage presence during these early years was magnetic and dangerous. She could purr like a kitten and snarl like a wildcat, sometimes within the same song, creating a persona that was simultaneously accessible and threatening. The platinum hair, blood-red lips, and ice-blue stare became her signature. But they were more than just aesthetic choices. They were armor, weapons, and artistic statement all rolled into one. The relationship with Chris was both creative partnership and romantic entanglement, a combination that generated incredible music and inevitable complications. They were lovers, collaborators, and sometimes adversaries bound together by their shared vision and mutual dependence. The chemistry that made their music electric also made their personal relationship volatile, a dynamic that would define both their art and their lives for decades to come. The early days of Blondie were marked by poverty, determination, and a shared belief that they were onto something revolutionary. They played for audiences of dozens in clubs where the sound system barely worked, perfecting a sound that would eventually conquer the world. The breakthrough was building slowly, song by song, performance by performance, but when it came, it would transform not just their lives but the entire landscape of popular music. The self-titled debut album in 1976 opened doors, but it was Heart of Glass in 1978 that truly changed everything. The song was a risk that paid off in ways no one could have predicted. A disco-influenced track that alienated some punk purists while attracting millions of new fans who had never heard of CBGB. The track was punk attitude wrapped in disco accessibility, creating something entirely new and utterly irresistible. Debbie's performance of Heart of Glass was hypnotic and revolutionary. The combination of her platinum hair, icy delivery, and the song's innovative blend of punk and disco created an image that was simultaneously accessible and untouchable. The music video, with its stark visuals and Debbie's commanding presence, became iconic, helping to define what a female rock star could look like in the emerging MTV era. The success was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Suddenly, Debbie Harry was on magazine covers around the world. Music videos were in constant rotation, and Blondie was selling millions of records to audiences who had never set foot in a punk club. The girl from Hawthorne who had dreamed of escape had not just escaped, she had conquered. But success in the music industry came with its own set of dangers that were more subtle and more destructive than anything she had faced on the streets of New York. The pressure was constant and relentless. More songs, more tours, more interviews, more of everything that had made her famous but was slowly consuming the person underneath the persona. The image that emerged from this period became iconic in ways that transcended music. The platinum blonde hair, blood-red lips, and expression that suggested both vulnerability and menace became the template for female rock stardom. Magazine covers featured her face with headlines that tried to capture her essence. The Ice Queen of Punk, the blonde bombshell who conquered rock, Beauty and the Beat, but behind the carefully constructed image, cracks were beginning to show. The constant touring, recording, and maintaining of her public persona was taking its toll on someone who had already survived more trauma than most people could imagine. The music industry's demands were relentless, and the substances that promised to make them bearable were always available. The drugs came gradually, then all at once. What started as recreational use to cope with the pressures of fame evolved into something darker and more destructive. Heroin offered an escape from the constant demands, a way to quiet the noise that success had brought into her life. But addiction was a predator more patient and more dangerous than any she had encountered on the streets of New York, and it began to devour everything she had worked to build. The media that had once celebrated her now began to circulate rumors about her decline. Stories appeared about missed performances, erratic behavior, and the gradual disintegration of the band that had once seemed unstoppable. The same magazines that had put her on covers now ran photographs that seemed designed to document her fall from grace, images that showed a woman fighting battles that couldn't be won with talent or determination alone. Then came the crisis that would test everything Debbie thought she knew about survival and sacrifice. Chris Stein's diagnosis with pemphigus, a rare autoimmune disease, brought a different kind of devastation into their lives. The illness threatened not just his life, but their creative partnership, their romantic relationship, and everything they had built together. The decision to put Blondie on hiatus to care for Chris was seen by some as career suicide, but for Debbie it was simply a matter of survival, his and her own. The woman who had conquered the world with her voice and her image now found herself in the unfamiliar role of caregiver, watching the man she loved fight for his life while the career that had defined her adult existence slowly faded into memory. The financial cost of Chris's medical treatment was staggering, forcing Debbie to make decisions that would have been unthinkable during Blondie's peak years. She sold personal possessions, liquidated investments, and took any work that would pay enough to cover the mounting medical bills. The woman who had once commanded six-figure recording contracts found herself accepting whatever opportunities presented themselves, regardless of how they might affect her reputation or artistic integrity. The media coverage during this period was often cruel and exploitative, treating Debbie's struggles as entertainment rather than recognizing the human cost of watching someone you love fight for their life while battling your own demons. The glamorous image that had once protected her now seemed to work against her, as if her beauty somehow made her suffering less real, or less deserving of sympathy. But perhaps the most devastating cost was emotional. The combination of addiction, financial pressure, and watching Chris's illness progress created a kind of psychological pressure that tested every survival skill she had developed over the years. The streets of New York had taught her how to avoid physical predators, but they hadn't prepared her for the more subtle destructions of addiction and loss. The crash didn't come as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow recognition that she was disappearing, fading away like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The mirror that had once reflected a punk goddess now showed someone she barely recognized, and Debbie realized that she had to choose between the substances that promised oblivion and the person she had fought so hard to become. The rehabilitation process was private, painful, and ultimately transformative. It required confronting not just the addiction, but all the trauma that had made the drug seem necessary in the first place. The adoption trauma, the sexual assault, the countless small violences that had accumulated over the years. The girl who had learned to survive on the streets of New York now had to learn to survive in her own mind, without chemical barriers to make the pain bearable. Chris's recovery was equally slow and uncertain, requiring years of treatment and rehabilitation that tested both their relationship and their individual resolve. The man who had once been Debbie's creative partner and romantic companion was now someone she was learning to love all over again. Someone who had been changed by illness in ways that were both subtle and profound. The music industry had moved on during Blondie's absence, embracing new sounds and new faces while treating the band as a relic of a previous era. The punk movement that had given birth to their career had evolved into something different, and the mainstream success they had once enjoyed seemed like ancient history to executives looking for the next big thing. But Debbie Harry was discovering something that her younger self couldn't have imagined. Survival was its own form of victory. Every day without drugs was a small triumph. Every day that Chris continued to improve was a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy them. The woman who had once measured success in platinum albums and sold-out concerts was learning to find meaning in smaller, more personal achievements. The decision to revive Blondie in the late 1990s wasn't motivated by nostalgia or financial necessity. It was driven by a desire to prove that they had survived everything the world had thrown at them and emerged stronger. The album No Exit and its hit single Maria weren't just comeback attempts. They were certificates of survival, proof that some things are too resilient to be destroyed by time, trauma, or industry indifference. Maria hitting #1 in the UK was more than just a commercial success. It was vindication, proof that quality and authenticity could still triumph over manufactured trends and disposable pop. The woman who returned to the spotlight was different from the one who had left it nearly 2 decades earlier, marked by experience but not broken by it. The woman who returned to the stage in the late 1990s carried herself differently than the punk goddess of the 1970s. The platinum hair was still perfect, the voice still powerful, but there was something new in her eyes. A wisdom that could only come from having walked through hell and chosen to keep walking. The audiences that welcomed her back included original fans who had waited decades for her return and new generations who were discovering her music for the first time. The critical reception of Blondie's reunion was surprisingly positive, with reviewers noting that Debbie's voice had gained depth and resonance during the years away. The songs she performed carried new weight, informed by experiences that had tested every aspect of her character. Heart of Glass was no longer just a disco-punk hybrid. It was an anthem of survival, performed by someone who had literally lived through the breaking and the healing. The touring that followed was both triumphant and surreal, bringing Debbie face to face with audiences who saw her as both contemporary artist and living legend. The punk clubs where she had honed her craft in the 1970s were now historic landmarks, and many of her contemporaries from that era had either died or disappeared from public view. She was becoming a survivor in a scene that had claimed many casualties. But Debbie refused to become a nostalgia act. Continuing to write new material, collaborate with younger artists, and explore musical territories that kept her artistically vital. She understood that survival wasn't just about living through trauma. It was about continuing to grow and evolve, despite everything that had tried to stop her. The relationship with Chris had evolved into something deeper and more complex than their original romantic partnership. They were collaborators who had survived addiction, illness, and industry rejection together, bound by shared experiences that went far beyond music. Their creative partnership had been tested by every possible disaster and had somehow emerged intact, perhaps stronger than it had ever been. The new millennium brought unexpected opportunities for an artist who had already exceeded her own survival expectations. Fashion magazines rediscovered her as a style icon, featuring spreads that celebrated her enduring beauty and influential aesthetic. Young designers cited her as inspiration, and her image appeared in contexts that celebrated her historical significance while acknowledging her contemporary relevance. The memoir, Face It, published in 2019, gave Debbie the opportunity to control her narrative for the first time in decades. The book revealed details about her life that had never been public before, including the full extent of her struggles with addiction and the true cost of Chris's illness. Writing the book was both therapeutic and exhausting, requiring her to revisit experiences she had sometimes spent years trying to forget. The response to the memoir was overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising her honesty and readers expressing gratitude for her willingness to share such personal experiences. The book became more than just celebrity autobiography. It was a masterclass in survival, a guide for anyone who had ever felt destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 presented new challenges for an artist in her 70s, forcing her to adapt to virtual performances and limited live opportunities. But Debbie approached these obstacles with the same determination that had carried her through addiction, illness, and industry rejection. She participated in live-streamed concerts, recorded new material during lockdown, and found ways to connect with fans despite the physical barriers imposed by the global crisis. The art world that had first welcomed her as Andy Warhol's muse now celebrated her as an artist in her own right. Her visual work, often created in collaboration with Chris Stein, explored themes of identity, survival, and transformation with the same fearless honesty that characterized her music. Galleries that had once displayed her image as pop culture artifact now exhibited her own creative work, acknowledging her evolution from muse to artist. The woman who had once declared she never expected to live to 30 was now approaching 80. Having outlived many of her contemporaries and influenced generations of artists who cited her as inspiration. The platinum hair was still perfect, the attitude still dangerous, and the voice still capable of cutting through noise to reach hearts and minds around the world. The concerts that continued into her 70s and beyond were celebrations of endurance as much as music. Audiences came to hear the hits they remembered from their youth, but they also came to witness something rarer. An artist who had refused to be defeated by anything life had thrown at her. The stage presence that had once been fueled by youth and rebellion was now powered by something deeper. The knowledge that every performance was a victory against the forces that had tried to silence her. The influence she had wielded over popular culture was impossible to quantify but undeniable in its scope. From fashion to music to art to the broader conversation about female empowerment, Debbie Harry had helped shape the cultural landscape in ways that continued to resonate decades after her initial breakthrough. Young women who discovered her music in the streaming age found in her an example of someone who had refused to be diminished by trauma, addiction, or the passage of time. The legacy that Debbie Harry was building went far beyond music. She had become a symbol of female empowerment in an industry that had traditionally marginalized women. Proof that beauty and intelligence could coexist, that vulnerability and strength were not contradictory. The aesthetic she had created, platinum hair, red lips, dangerous attitude, had become timeless, influencing fashion and art across multiple decades. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her longevity was her refusal to become a museum piece. While many of her contemporaries were content to rest on past achievements, she continued to push boundaries, collaborate with unexpected partners, and explore musical territories that kept her artistically vital. The woman who had once been punk's most unlikely star had become its most enduring survivor. The music industry that had once threatened to destroy her now looked to her as an elder stateswoman, someone whose longevity and continued creativity served as inspiration for younger artists facing their own struggles. The punk movement that had given her career its foundation had evolved and fragmented, but her influence remained constant, a reminder of what authentic rebellion looked like. The city that had both nurtured and nearly destroyed her, New York, had changed beyond recognition since her arrival in the 1960s. But she remained connected to its essential spirit of reinvention and resilience. The clubs where she had honed her craft were now tourist destinations, but the energy that had created those scenes lived on in new venues and new artists who cited her as inspiration. As she entered her 9th decade, Debbie Harry represented something increasingly rare in popular culture. An artist who had maintained both relevance and integrity across multiple decades. The woman who had once been dismissed as just another pretty face had proven that beauty and substance could coexist, that survival was its own form of artistry, and that authentic expression could transcend any barrier the world might construct. The platinum hair that had become her signature was still perfect, the voice that had launched a revolution was still powerful, and the attitude that had defined punk femininity was still dangerous after all these years. She had survived everything that had tried to destroy her. Adoption trauma, sexual assault, addiction, industry exploitation, personal loss, and had somehow transformed those experiences into art that continued to inspire and influence. The heart of glass that once seemed so fragile had proven to be virtually unbreakable, reflecting light in ways that continued to dazzle and inspire. In a world that often confused fame with meaning and visibility with value, Debbie Harry remained a reminder that true iconography was built not on perfection, but on the courage to be authentically, dangerously, beautifully human. "The only thing I really wanted was to be somebody," she had once said, and her life had become the ultimate expression of that simple desire. She had become somebody worth becoming, not just a star, but a survivor. Not just an icon, but an inspiration. Not just a voice, but a testament to the power of refusing to be silenced. The mirror that had once reflected an uncertain teenager in suburban New Jersey now showed a woman who had become exactly who she was meant to be. The journey from Angela Trimble to Debbie Harry had been marked by more trauma and triumph than most people could imagine. But it had ultimately led to something unprecedented. A punk goddess who had not only survived her own mythology but had continued to expand it. As the spotlights continue to illuminate her platinum hair and the crowds continue to sing along to songs that have become anthems of survival, Debbie Harry stands as living proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers do indeed grow in the darkest soil. She is the punk goddess who survived it all, the beauty who conquered the beast of fame and addiction, the icon who proved that part of being legendary is simply refusing to disappear. In the end, Debbie Harry taught the world a lesson that took decades to learn. Survival is the most punk rock thing of all. She wanted to be somebody, and she became everybody's proof that authenticity cannot be destroyed, that resilience can be cultivated, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to give up. The heart of glass was never fragile. It was forged in fire, tempered by time, and ultimately revealed to be unbreakable.